thought, one of the things a mayor does is give big speeches. They're a little different these days, but I've given four major speeches, and to kind of get into what's going on in the community and such, I thought I'd just reference those, not go through them. But those are the places where I really try to set a course, try to articulate in a bigger picture kind of what's going on in the community, and of course try to do that in settings like this too. But those four major speeches this year were the inaugural address, which I gave on January 1st. And then I had the State of the City, the traditional annual report and discussion of where the city is. That was in February. Then I gave a speech I called it 10 Tough Weeks, which was in May, which was kind of dealing with the 10 weeks of the pandemic that we were in right then, and trying to put that in perspective and talk about where we're going. And then just 10 or 11 days ago, I gave a speech I call Recover Forward, which was trying to put the first 6 months of this year into some context and kind of talk about a course going forward for the community. And so I thought I'll just kind of bounce through the most recent one and then make a few observations and then open it up for questions. So Recover Forward, which isn't the most beautiful phrase or anything, but it really tries to set the course for thinking about how do we move forward. I identified four major challenges that are right in front of Bloomington right now. First, the health crisis, the pandemic, which has turned upside down so many of our lives, and every city employee works differently today than they did in February. And of course, it's had a huge impact in our community, from fatalities to disease to changing how we operate. That's one huge challenge, the health pandemic. A second, related, is the economic recession. As we shut down the community under state orders, under local orders, we had thousands of people thrown out of work. We have had a huge disruption to our economy. And that's a major challenge for me in the mayor's seat to think about. How do we deal with that? How do we try to recover, minimize pain and damage? So that second was the economic recession. A third big challenge is racial justice, the issues of race in our community. Those, of course, have been with us for generations and continue to be with us. They really bloomed, erupted, arose in great energy with George Floyd lynching in Minneapolis and others, and then actually kind of took a local turn too on the July 4th weekend when we had an episode at Lake Monroe and others. And that issue of racial justice, the 20 million or so Americans that have marched, enormous numbers of people saying enough is enough. It is time to make progress on this in new ways and deeper ways. So that's a third big challenge. And a fourth is climate change. I talked a lot about it in January and February. It has taken a back seat in a way, but it is not going anywhere. And the challenge of climate justice and climate change is kind of churning away in the background as a big challenge to all of us in Bloomington and the country. So any one of those four is an enormous challenge to a community, to a government, to a mayor. And then I just kind of would have to add in the extraordinary national divisiveness and disarray and lack of pulling together on these in so many ways. So it's a challenging time, and that's what Recover Forward tried to think about how we're going to move forward. I sometimes describe government's role in 5 words. Say it can be described in 5 words. Pick important problems, period. Fix them. If government does that, that's often a good description of what we should do. Now, I will note, sometimes we pick problems, and sometimes problems pick us. We've certainly seen times when problems have picked us. And at the highest level, I would also just say, from my seat and as mayor and looking at the community, at the highest level, a lot of what we try to do is help our community be the place that we want to be. Help our community reflect the values that infuse most of us. It's a democracy. We, of course, don't all agree on that, but at a very high level, government is trying to help our community be what we want to be and reflect those values. And we also more specifically try to help our government be the best partner we can be as we try to implement those values. I do think those four challenges do reflect the values of our community generally, that they are things we want to address, respond to humanely. And I also think that we want our government to be a strong partner in this, that we, as we try to imbue our values and live our values, that we want our government to be a partner in that. So that's what Recover Forward was really talking about. How do we be a partner from government in reflecting those values better in our community? And I'll just mention a couple things, and then we'll be ready to open up for questions. One, to be a strong government partner to try to help accomplish these things, we need to be fiscally responsible. We need to manage our balance sheet, our income statement, our financial situation well, so we can be a strong partner. We need to be active where we can be, and where we need to be. There are places where government needs to act, and there are places where we can act. And particularly in my view, in these days, we should be active in that way. So Recover Forward really gave a fiscal outline of what is our fiscal situation, what can we do now as a government. We have very strong reserves, and I tried to talk about the rainy day reserves. This is a rainy day. So we have these reserves built up for this purpose, and I outlined basically using $8 million, half of which to protect our basic services and half of which to be a counter-cyclical government, a government that tries to help us recover more quickly, more humanely, reduce the damage. I outlined the three kind of buckets of work that I felt were important in that counter-cyclical. One was sustainability and equity, trying to invest now in ways we can become more equitable as a community by race, by economy, more sustainable with climate justice was the biggest bucket. A second is housing, affordable housing, continuing to try to make sure people can live in the community that they want to live in and do that safely and decently. And third was on jobs, trying to just help the private economy, the jobs economy of nonprofits and businesses recover more quickly. So I talked about how to do that as a partner, and I'll be happy to dig into much more detail about that. And then lastly, I think you may, if you want to talk about too, thinking about resources. As a government, we need resources to do our work. And I did explore and will continue to explore ideas of where we can get resources to supplement that work. And I see I'm at 10 minutes. I promised I would try to stick to 10 minutes. So let me stop and let you well-versed press people just dig in and ask questions, and I'll try to respond to those. So it's really nice to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks very much. I see one question has come in from the chat window, and I'll read that now. In this time of the pandemic, how would you characterize the relationship of the city and the university?
Yeah, I think the first word I would use is essential. It is so important for us to work together. I have been meeting regularly with Lauren Rebell, in particular the provost, several times a week. We also have our regular town gown meetings that we've had kind of through the institutional rhythms, larger meetings. And it is a really complicated and moving picture as IU since spring break has tried to figure out what's their path, and as the city has tried to navigate our path. In addition to us, of course, we have county health officials there, and we have IU health officials there, and others trying to help navigate this stuff. So it's an essential relationship. It's complex, much like a school corporation trying to figure out how do they reopen. IU is weighing hundreds of choices, and I don't pretend to be able to describe all that they're doing. I will give you I guess I think I can give you one example of some of the frustrations that happen when we're working together is IU wanted to require testing of all students before they return. That's a smart thing because if we can identify 100 or 200 or 300 IU students who are presently infectious, it would be better for all of us to say, stay where you are, don't come to campus, don't come to town. It turns out the testing capacities in our state did not allow that to happen. And IU had to step back, rejigger, rethink, well, how are we going to deal with this if we can't get people tested before they come? They're going to be testing when people arrive. But as you could imagine, that means off-campus students, most of them will not be tested before they come, which means we're going to have hundreds of students arriving who are infectious probably over the next few weeks. So it makes a huge challenge, but we're working closely. It's very complicated.
I'll throw one out there. Have the recent months, I guess, led you to think about the structure of the city and any departments that, you're thinking, oh, that would have been great if we had that set up? Or I guess, does this make you think about any sort of restructuring of the city government? Or maybe you haven't had time to reflect back, or maybe it's all set up as efficiently as it could be.
Well, I'm sure it's not as efficient as it can be. I mean, one obvious one is public safety, right? So there's been an enormous effort to think about what does public safety mean? How do we achieve it? And those are very good questions. They're questions that have been important to me since I've been mayor. We've been trying to rethink the police department. We've added new things. We have a very progressive police department, probably the most progressive in the state and among those around the country that tries to think about this, but that doesn't mean we're where we want to be. And we've added a social worker in the last year or two. We added neighborhood resource specialists, which are non-sworn, non-armed officer employees who help our community. We continue to use the Downtown Resource Officer program. We've just opened a Stride Center, which is kind of a diversion center. So there's that going on. But of course, the question of what should a police department look like 10 years from now is a really interesting question, and one that we will be digging into. I'll probably be talking more about that yet this week. Another angle to that question, Efrat, is health. So I watch around the country as various cities which have their own health departments try to respond to this. We don't have our health department. Indianapolis, Marion County does as they're merged, but everything else is set up by the county health system. But Indiana does not have a good public health system. We are one of the least per capita funded in the country, about 49th or high 40s, at least in terms of per capita investment in public health. We have a very diffuse county-based system without much integration. There's a lot of this. So as a city, I think, well, how do I'm not going to try to step in and create a health department for the city. But thinking about how do we organize and implement that over the next year or two is really important for us to think about. So those are part of what we think about. Yeah.
I'm going to read another question that's coming from chat. This is a journalism group, so we're not going to bury the lead here. This time I'm reading again, in this time of economic uncertainty and crisis, why would you propose a tax increase?
Well, that's a great question. I tried to talk about that in Recover Forward and encourage you to look at that at more length. As I think about the challenges, those 4 challenges in front of us, and think about how as a community we try to live our values, one of the big questions is what do we invest in those recovery challenges, in racial justice, in climate justice, in economic justice, and economic recovery? And I will admit to you that when I became mayor of Bloomington, I had no idea that, and that was 5 years ago, I had no idea that Bloomington had the lowest income tax of all 7 counties around us. This most progressive community and county has the lowest income tax, which is one of the only ways that local communities can have local fiscal home rule. It's one of the only ways we can significantly affect what we invest in, because property taxes, the overall amount of property tax collection, the levy, is basically set by the state in a formula. You can't do much with that. And so it was striking to me, I didn't know, and the fact that we have that lowest level. If you actually take the 21 counties beyond just the 7, the 21 counties that we're closest to, we're 19th out of 21 in terms of our income tax rate. So I wouldn't suggest an income tax rate if I thought our capacity wasn't there. Capacity meaning, are we a high tax community already? Are we stressing our community? Well, we're a very low tax community compared to our neighbors. Now, what are our ambitions? If our ambitions are low and our ambitions are fine and we're modest and we don't want to do a lot on climate or on economic justice or on racial justice, then I'd say stick to it. But I don't think our ambitions and our values are modest. I think our ambitions and our values are strong and high. And I think in order to achieve those, we need to think about resources. The last point I'll make on that is, no, I would rather not do what would be called kind of a counter-cyclical work. I mean, raising taxes when the economy is in a difficulty is not what a fiscal economist recommending would bring to us. So I think the question is, does the revenue of the tax justify the benefit? Do the benefits of the investment of the tax justify that? And the only point I'll make from a macroeconomic, and I'm sure there's some economists in the room, and I'm not one, but I do think it's important to realize the scale of what we're talking about. The National Stimulus Program, that's the macroeconomic program to try to help our country recover, is something in the scale of $7,000 to $8,000 per capita that is being pushed into our economy across the whole country. $7,000 or $8,000, and it may go up with around 4. The local tax that we're discussing is about $50 per capita. So in terms of macroeconomic effect or contractionary or other things, it's less than 100th. So it is perfectly appropriate to say, is it worth doing that to do the things that help us achieve our values? But I do think it's important to note in the macroeconomic sense, this is it's not a macroeconomic impact. Of course, it can affect families, and we need to pay attention to that. But I just wanted to note the scale of what's going on in the country right now. Thanks. And it'll be a big discussion and debate, no question about it.
John, you've been talking about your Recover Forward speech, and I did want to point out that I put a link to that in the chat.
Thank you.
The county issued a press release on Friday that was in response to that, and I would say pretty pointed and at times maybe even feisty. Could you talk a little bit about that response in particular, but also just in general, the city-county relations and what you're doing to improve them, which I think it would be a good goal. Thanks.
Sure. Well, the city-county relations are very good. We work very closely in 100 ways, and we do that every day. We continue from law enforcement to fire protection, public safety, to animal control, to planning and kind of water systems, and all of the 100 ways that happens. There's been, there were some different differences of opinion about the convention center, which caused some difficulty in the county city relationship. Not unusual. There, of course, were issues from years past about annexation that were some sources of stress. But I get along very well with all my county colleagues. We may have different views of how to move forward in particular ways. That's a democracy. That's fine. I'm going to continue to advocate for what I think are the highest values of the community I serve and what people are asking us to be and how to structure our community. And the county, I know, does the same. It's always important to remember that most county residents are city residents, and so the county government represents mostly city residents, so there's a huge amount of overlap. And I'm, what is it they used to say about Italian government? I don't mean to be insulting in any way about Italian government, but the Parliament often would dissolve every 9 months, and the newspapers would say, "Situation is desperate but not serious." Some of these disputes are they feel more. They're not as serious as they may appear. I think there's a lot of good collaboration going on.
And I'd like to follow up on the last two questions that kind of link them together. One simple kind of follow up on regarding the proposal for increasing the local option income tax. What would be the time frame for that? When would that be considered, and when would it take effect if approved? And the other part is is there a real issue of fairness for people who live outside of the city when the city is able to? City officials are the ones who make up a majority of the income tax board and would be able to institute that tax.
So the local income tax, all those things are set by state statute. Of course, the state just defines what communities are allowed to do, how we can raise revenue, what processes we follow for that, just like they define annexation, for example. And I don't think this group would be surprised to hear me describe the state legislature as relatively anti-municipality. I think if we look at the policies that are implemented, it's often frustrating for mayors and municipalities of both parties to see kind of the handcuffs that are put on us and some of the strictures that are put on municipalities through the state legislature. So the local option income tax, which, for example, is a flat tax, there's no way a community can make it progressive. We're not allowed to do that under state law. But the tax is imposed under state law by the Local Option Income Tax Council, which is created by state law and defined by state law, which says who gets which votes and how that gets implemented. We passed it in 2016. We passed a public safety local income tax of 0.25%. And followed all those rules, and we have to follow the rules that are given to us today. If the city were allowed to have our own local income tax, that would be great. I kind of don't think the legislature is likely to do that. There were some proposals last year to change quite dramatically the authority of cities to control their own fiscal destiny, and to kind of leave it solely in the hands of a county executive or county legislative bodies, which would be very difficult for cities. Different politics, different demands on government, and those kinds of things. So that's how it's set up, and the timing is set. There's several dates in a year that determine when a tax goes into effect. If a tax is passed, I think any time from January to the end of October, the tax goes into effect January 1 the next year. If it's passed in November or December of a year, it's too soon. It doesn't go into effect the following January, and I forget when it goes into effect later that next year, or maybe the following January, I'm not sure. And then it's probably worth noting, too, that the legislature, even in the last session, changed the voting rules for local income tax in the middle of all this, and said they changed the way we count votes in an unusual way, and in a way that expires in May. So I do expect the state legislature is probably going to revisit how the local income tax works. As to fairness, all I can say is we deal the hand we're dealt that tells us how to pass these things. I would not be at all against the idea of having cities have their own authority to pass these, but I'm very hesitant to expect the legislature to grant that kind of fiscal autonomy to cities. I wish they would.
I'm going to read a couple questions that have come in on chat. One member says, I've heard FEMA has been diverting resources from Indiana to states with higher case numbers of COVID. Is that accurate? And if so, how might that affect Monroe County?
So what I can say about that is I don't have firsthand knowledge. I have had reported to me that some state officials have indicated FEMA has been allocating particularly test resources. I don't know exactly if that's the testing medium or the testing, but to testing capacity. I've heard reported to me that FEMA has been allocating those from states to states, and that Indiana had some removed, if you will, from what was expected or projected or on hand. It's just a sign to me. Look, FEMA may need to do that. I don't try to estimate that. FEMA has to respond to the crises that are in front of it. It does, to me, show how terribly ill prepared we are for the testing that we ought to have nationally if we're having to pull testing capacity away from Indiana, which then hurts Indiana University, which then hurts Monroe County and our ability to protect ourselves. So if that is in fact the case, which again I don't have firsthand knowledge, and I wish it were reported in the press because the lack of transparency is terrible on this stuff. It should be reported, and we got to own what's happening. That does affect us because we have less testing capacity. It's just harder to understand what's going on and harder to contact trace when we see things happening.
Another COVID-related question from chat. We're hearing that there will be another wave of COVID later in the year. What plan does the city have in place to navigate additional challenges?
Well, of course, nobody knows what will happen. We're doing what we can to diminish the chances of such a resurgence or another wave. Certainly, it's possible. For quite a number of weeks, I was urging on the balance of cost and benefit, the cost of two things: a mask ordinance, and then serious restrictions on what can be super spreader events, like in a bar or in a big social gathering where you can get 50 people infected in one evening. I've been encouraging that the cost of doing that is pretty low from a community-wide perspective. I don't want to diminish that, and the benefit could be very substantial if it were, for example, the way that our schools and our university could stay open, if that would help. So those kinds of steps we have now taken, and I moved up faster to do that in the city, as you probably know, on bars and restaurants. The state did a mask order soon after we did, which is good. Absolutely, there are additional steps. Indianapolis has closed all bars. They've closed all restaurants between midnight and 5 a.m. There are places that only allow outdoor dining. Of course, we could have stronger stay-at-home orders. We know those are costly and difficult in lots of ways, invisible ways even. But those are all on the play sheet for what we may need to do. And school corporations and universities and private employers all have to be thinking about how they're going to manage. I don't know if it's been public, but I got a call that said Nick's is going to close. They may be closed now just because of an eruption of cases in their employees. And so businesses are going to have to make that choice too.
Another question, or actually a couple questions from chat that go together. I don't know if you can answer this, but we're going to ask, what would you like to see happen with the current Bloomington Hospital property? Or if not specific, even kind of what your priorities and values would be in terms of how you think that property, city property now, should be put to use. And also, what about the Waldron Arts Center property?
Yeah, great. So I worked really hard 2 or 3 years ago to try to put us in this seat to strike a deal to buy the property from Bloomington Hospital so that we could, as a community, plan the future. If we didn't own it, we would, of course, have the power to zone and do things and invest in infrastructure. But I felt that this was a once-in-a-century opportunity to get 24 acres right downtown and really think together about what that ought to be. So I'm glad we did that. We got it a great deal. And now the community sits in this seat. And so the first answer of what I want to see happen is I want to have an engaged process with our community to talk about what are the values we want to see manifest in this redevelopment. I don't want the community designing the buildings and designing all this stuff, because that's really complicated and we hire really smart people to help us do that. But I absolutely do want the community helping talk about what are the values we want embedded in, reflected in this redevelopment. What do we want to spend our money on? What do we want to see it turn into? And that process is underway. We've got a terrific team of partners led by an architecture firm that we picked after a big process. And it's an imagining process, and it's trying to think about what does that mean. I have a sense of what some of those values are. I think affordable housing, meaning from low income all the way up to workforce housing, and but making housing more available for people in the community. I think the issue of creating a visionary and forward looking new neighborhood in our community that 50 years from now people will treasure as a great neighborhood is a value for me. Sustainability, equity, those are really important values to reflect. And it's exciting. It's kind of this big blank canvas to think about what should be done there. How does it relate to downtown? How does it work symbiotically with downtown? It's incredible. So I'm trying not to, put blinders on and think I know what ought to be done, but trying to listen to that process. And we hope to have a master plan by the end of the year. So jump in and let your voice be heard. Second, on Waldron, that was one of those where, that Ivy Tech came to us and said, we've had a good 10-year run, but we just can't keep doing this. The city had the right to get that building back. It was originally, of course, a public building, City Hall and others. And I felt it was prudent, rather than have Ivy Tech sell it off to somebody, and it was prudent to take that back. So we're negotiating and figuring out a lot of those details. And again, I think we need a process to think about what's the right thing going forward. The only caution, look, it's been an incredible arts center, and arts are part of our DNA. They're incredibly important, and many people are urging let's make it an art center. Let's keep it an art center and reimagine it that way. And that's a really good idea. I also do think, maybe not unrelated to the previous question about the hospital, if we're going to be rebuilding 24 acres, is this building where we want this art center to happen over the next 30 years or 40 years? Is this the right physical space? Maybe it is, but maybe there's new space we can do that would be built for arts, that would be more effective and more useful and create a new dynamic over the next decades. And I don't, again, we shouldn't have blinders on that we don't dare imagine new and changing futures for this stuff. So let's keep our eyes on the horizon. Let's think about our values, and let's think about how best to accomplish them with both of these things.
So here's another question that's come in on chat. Kind of jumping around. We've got several questions here. And I know elections are conducted by the county and not by the city, but is you may know something about this, is mail-in voting going to be encouraged and an option for all registered voters during the November election? And if so, will there be any kind of campaign to raise awareness of that? My understanding is that decision hasn't been made, and it will probably take some guidance from the state. But is the city involved in that? Or are you involved in that in any way in trying to ensure that people can vote safely?
Well, I am trying to do all I can. It's outrageous that we're not having no excuse absentee balloting, which is what we're talking about, where anybody can use a mail-in ballot if they feel they need to. We did it for the primary. It worked well. We're not in a better spot. We don't know that we're in a better spot for November. And it's just, from my perspective, completely irresponsible that the state is playing games. I think they're kind of playing political games with this. This is a political football, and there's a bunch of misinformation about it. But mail-in voting is extremely reliable. It's much safer. There's no reason we shouldn't be doing it. It does take a state election board action. The governor has so far just kind of ducked down and said, I like to vote in person. I think it's nice. Fine, you vote in person, but there are a lot of people who don't want to, and you should let them. They'll make 2 points. There's a lawsuit going on that I've been trying to be helpful with that is challenging that. The second thing is our current legislation, so far as I know, says you can get a mail-in ballot if you say, for reasons of illness, I don't think I'll be able to vote on election day. Maybe I'll just say the reason of illness is COVID-19, and that's the reason I don't want to vote in person. So send me a ballot and kind of challenge it. But it needs to be coordinated. It's a shame that we aren't making it easier to vote. So I'll be doing all I can on that. But it is mostly a state and a county election board decision, really driven by the state. Call your governor. Call your state representatives.
Another question from chat. To what extent are you working with mayors and other government officials in other communities, I think, to rein in the virus? The person makes the observation, well, most Bloomingtonians wear masks, and I think that depends on where you go, probably more now with this orders going into effect. I understand that it isn't true in Bedford, Martinsville, and other nearby communities. People move back and forth, shop back and forth between those communities. Is there any way to work together with other communities to, present more of a united front?
I work a fair amount with folks both in Indiana and nationally to get resources, to get ideas, to share ideas. For example, I've spoken directly to the mayors of South Bend and West Lafayette as we were looking at how do you manage a national university and how the students are going to be coming back to town, and that how are you managing that? And it's actually been very helpful. I think those three cities and their universities have been in contact with the governor and the state health departments, trying to say, look, we're a little unusual. We got thousands of students coming from all over the country. Work with us to explore ways to do that better. I had a phone call the other day from the mayor of Huntingburg, who was asking us about our mask order. We, truth be told, stole a lot of our mask order from the Marion County mask order, which has done a lot of really intensive work to go through the exceptions and think about those details. We've done the same with, with some of the approaches to bars and restaurants. When you do these mayor meetings, we often talk about our R&D that we do as mayors, and what that stands for is rip off and duplicate. We just rip off and duplicate anything we can find that works anywhere else. So there's a lot of that going on in a very, most positive kind of rip off and duplicate. But we're also scrambling. It's crazy that all of us are having to figure out what's the right thing to do. It's crazy that every school district has to try to manage and put together a plan when we have brilliant scientists, and that's what governments and bureaucracies are for, is to try to help bring science and reason and research to all this, and we're all kind of having to scramble to do that as best we can.
Another question from chat. Having city meetings on Zoom has opened up access to a much broader swath of the community. Will you be advocating to keep an online interactive component of public meetings?
Absolutely. This has been a really important demonstration that there are different ways to do things. There are different people who can access public meetings who can't attend in person very easily. It's been a really important lesson and reminder that we can get stuck in ruts of how we do things. And I absolutely will be supporting continuing to make these kinds of technologies and access available for public meetings, for workplaces and others. I think that's been a positive lesson out of this.
I'm going to ask you to talk about the census a little bit. I know during the State of the City, that was a big theme. That everyone needs to be counted. We have those everyone counts buttons going around. But now we've got a very different situation. And the question that comes in is, how will the absence of students affect the census count and thus the city's resources and city budget and so on? But I think more broadly also, how challenging is it to have the census take place during this particular time for a community like Bloomington, where a segment of the population may not be coming back here?
It's terrifying is the short answer. It's been a casualty of COVID and all the stress that's happening and the disarray. The census was kind of a mess. Even without all of this, there was such controversy and consternation and politicization of it. That itself was daunting and concerning, and now I'm terrified. I think we're doing all we can. We're doing what we can. It's a very challenging time. And again, I would remind us, as the lowest of 7 lit funded counties in the area, there are just so many resources that we have. And when I'm scrambling to respond to health emergencies and economic calamities, the census is a challenge to invest the money and take. We are very dependent upon the systems that are out there to do that. I think I would just note, I am hopeful that if there is a government change at the national level, that government coming in will be very sensitive to the challenges that the census has gone through, and I actually believe they'll be pretty thoughtful and careful trying to make it come out the way it should. It's just meant to count where people are. I am very worried that if there is not a change and we have the same government that was trying to put a citizenship question on it and is now trying to stop people from answering it, that will be a disaster for us. As I said, if we miss 1 out of 300 people in counting, if we miss 1 out of 300 people, it can cost us $1 million a year in federal support. If you miss 5 out of 300, it can cost you $5 million. It's so the stakes are really high.
I wanted to ask too about, and this is something I haven't heard too much discussion of, is there's been quite a bit, we've heard quite a bit about how the downturn in the economy has affected state revenues. I haven't heard much about whether and how it's affected city revenues. Presumably income tax would be affected eventually, but are you seeing anything from that? And then at the same time, there is apparently some talk about a second round or an additional round of federal assistance. I think I heard that the Senate Republicans were going to show their cards maybe today.
Yeah, I heard that.
What are the chances that cities would be helped out by that, or either directly or indirectly?
So the overall question of revenue, it appears there are certain things that we get hit really hard right away. The gas tax revenue, which is quite important for some pieces of what we do, has been hammered and will probably continue to be hammered. So that really affects our street department, for example, which gets significant funding from the gas tax revenue from the state. The property tax revenue, we get our two main sources are property tax and income tax, including the local income tax. But of course we get stuff outside of that. But the property tax is so formulaic and long-term 7-year averages and such that we do expect to see some impact from that, but probably not major. And in fact, we just got the indication for 2021. The state has given a 4.2% increase in the levy. So that's bigger than last year. That's pretty substantial. We will see some income tax hits, we think. We get hit really hard too. For example, in Parks and Recreation, a lot of revenue that Parks gets is gone this year because of programming that just cannot happen. So that hits our Parks Department in particular. But that was really what Recover Forward was about. I've reserved $4 million, $2 million each for 2021 and 2022 out of our reserves to protect the basic operations of city government, to make sure we can continue to do all the things people expect us to do, even as we tighten our belt. And I think the expectation is that the state revenue, they get hit really big on sales tax, and it's a big challenge for funding of schools, K through 12, and universities and others. The biggest parts of the state budget are K-12, Medicaid, prisons, and infrastructure, and those hit them, and they do trickle down to us, but not quite as directly. I hope federal government will do things to support cities and counties and states. They should, because we have to balance our budget, unlike them. And if you have a bunch of governments cutting people and such, that's not a good thing. I don't know if that answered everything. I'm trying to be quick because I know if you have more questions.
We're heading up on 1 o'clock here, and well, most of us don't have like offices we have to hurry back to anymore. We don't want to take too much of people's time, so I want to give you a chance to, and there certainly are a lot of other things we could ask about, a lot of other topics that come to mind for me and other people as well, I'm sure. So we'll have to have you back, I think.
I'd be delighted.
That'll be a plan. Members, once again, Margie Hershey in September. I believe it's the 28th, no meeting in August. So, Mayor, would you like to just take a couple minutes to wrap up and touch on anything we missed?
That's very kind of you. Dangerous giving me the platform last, huh? No. Listen, I thank you all for what you do. I guess I think I would just make this point, reaching out to you not only as members or veterans of the journalism and Fifth Estate, but as residents, that these are really challenging times in terms of trying to sustain the kind of the social fabric that keeps us kind of the muscle memory of how communities work, how societies work. There is so much hostility. There is so much paranoia and suspicion that can breed, and that actually we know there are players that like to encourage and breed and support that. That it's really important that we keep reminding ourselves we're in this together. We're a community of people who care about each other and care about our community, and we have big challenges in front of us, and we're going to disagree on approaches to it, which is natural and fine and good. But let's try to take keep reminding how much we have in common, and as we communicate with each other, as we discuss options with each other, that we remember we're all in this together, and we have big challenges that are really hard to wrestle with, and we're not going to fix them all in 30 days or 1 year or even 3 years, but that we can make real progress, and just to rebuild that muscle memory of community engagement and a community can do spirit, which is hard when we can't get together and slap each other on the back and hug each other and remind each other of how much we have in common. So help create that tone, if you will, and help us try to meet these big challenges, which I think are very real in front of us. And our decisions over the next days and weeks and months and years are going to chart the path of this community. And it's an unknown path. We are going to decide it, and let's try to do the best we can.
Very good. Thank you very much. We're right up.